In 1661, a Spanish princess arrived at the French court, unable to speak, barely able to walk, and so physically deformed that courtiers whispered she was cursed. Her family tree wasn't a tree at all. It was a closed loop, a genetic nightmare spanning 2 centuries. She wasn't alone. Across Europe's grandest palaces, behind gilded doors and silk curtains, royal bloodlines were collapsing in on themselves. Children born with bodies that couldn't survive, mothers who buried infant after infant, queens whose very existence was an act of biological defiance. Tonight we're pulling back the curtain on one of history's darkest secrets, the women whose bodies became battlegrounds for dynastic ambition. Women who paid the price for power with their health, their children, and sometimes their sanity. What you're about to hear will change everything you thought you knew about royal life. Hey everyone, welcome back. Tonight we're diving into something a little heavier, a little darker, but utterly fascinating. Before we begin this journey together, I'd love to know, where in the world are you listening from right now? And what time is it where you are? There's something special about knowing we're all scattered across different time zones, different continents, but somehow connected through these stories from centuries past. Go ahead and settle in. Dim the lights if you can. Maybe light a candle. Pour yourself some tea. Get comfortable, because we're going back in time, way back, to an era when your bloodline determined everything. Your power, your wealth, your very survival. And for the women we'll meet tonight, their bloodlines determined something else, whether their bodies would even function properly. Let's start with a question that might seem simple. Why would royal families deliberately marry within their own bloodlines, knowing the risks? The answer is as old as monarchy itself. Power. Pure, concentrated, undiluted power. In medieval and early modern Europe, land was currency. Titles were treasures. And royal blood? That was sacred. Kings and queens didn't just rule territories. They believed they were chosen by God, set apart from ordinary mortals by divine right. Their blood, quite literally, was considered different, special, holy. So when it came time to marry off a prince or princess, the pool of acceptable candidates was impossibly small. You couldn't marry a commoner. That would dilute the sacred bloodline. You couldn't marry someone from a rival faith. That would anger God and destabilize the realm. And you certainly couldn't risk your inheritance falling into the hands of a foreign power through an unwise alliance. The solution? Marry your cousins, your uncles, your nieces, keep it in the family, keep the power concentrated, keep the bloodline pure. Except blood doesn't work that way. Genetics don't care about crowns or divine right. And what these royal families were really doing, generation after generation, was creating a genetic catastrophe that would echo through centuries. Tonight we're going to meet the women who lived inside that catastrophe. Women born into bodies that struggled to survive from their first breath. Women who were married off to relatives to produce heirs, only to watch their babies die in infancy. Women whose very existence challenges our romanticised notions of royal life. This isn't a story about ball gowns and tiaras. This is a story about what happens when ambition overrides biology, when politics trump humanity, when women's bodies become nothing more than vessels for continuing a bloodline, no matter the cost. So take a deep breath, because we're about to descend into the vaults of European history, where the skeletons have stories to tell. Let's begin with perhaps the most extreme case of royal inbreeding ever documented, Maria Antonia of Austria. If you've never heard her name, that's not surprising. History tends to remember her famous cousin, Charles II of Spain, the last Habsburg king, whose physical deformities were so severe he could barely eat or speak. But here's what most people don't know. Maria Antonia was actually more inbred than Charles. Let that sink in for a moment. Born in 1669 in Vienna, Maria Antonia entered the world as a genetic impossibility. When scientists finally analysed her family tree centuries later, they discovered something that should have been biologically impossible. Her level of inbreeding was higher than if her parents had been full siblings. Think about that. Higher than if her mother and father had shared both parents. How does that even happen? The answer lies in something called pedigree collapse. Imagine a family tree that, instead of branching outward with each generation, folds back in on itself, over and over again. For the Habsburgs, this wasn't an accident, it was policy. Maria Antonia's great-great-great-grandfather was the Holy Roman Emperor Maximilian I. Now, in a normal family tree, if you go back 5 generations, you'd have 32 unique ancestors in that generation. But Maria Antonia, she had only a handful. The same names appeared over and over in different positions as aunts married nephews, cousins married cousins, and the gene pool shrank to the size of a puddle. Her father, Holy Roman Emperor Leopold I, had married his own niece. Her mother, Margarita Teresa of Spain, was herself the product of an uncle-niece marriage. Margarita Teresa's parents were actually uncle and niece too. King Philip IV of Spain had married his own brother's daughter. Can you see the pattern forming? Like a spider's web, except instead of silk, it's woven from compromised DNA. Maria Antonia would have been a delicate child. We don't have detailed health records from her infancy, but we can extrapolate from what we know about Habsburg children of this era. Many were born with what was called the Habsburg jaw, a severe underbite caused by a malformed mandible. They often had breathing problems, digestive issues, and developmental delays. The Habsburg jaw wasn't just cosmetic, it was a sign of something deeper, a cascade of genetic problems that affected the entire body. These children often couldn't chew properly, which led to malnutrition. They were prone to infections because their immune systems were compromised. Many died before reaching adulthood. Maria Antonia survived childhood, which in itself was remarkable, but her real purpose, in the eyes of her family, was yet to come. She would be married off to secure a political alliance. At age 16, still just a girl really, Maria Antonia was shipped off to Bavaria to marry Maximilian II Emanuel, Elector of Bavaria. The match was strategic. Bavaria was a crucial ally for the Habsburgs in their endless wars against France. Maria Antonia's body was the bargaining chip. The marriage was reportedly happy enough by royal standards. Maximilian was a military man, often away on campaigns. Maria Antonia, meanwhile, was expected to do one thing: produce heirs. She had her first child in 1688, a son, Joseph Ferdinand. The relief must have been overwhelming. A healthy male heir, proof that despite her genetic burden, she could fulfill her duty. But here's where the story gets darker, because even though little Joseph Ferdinand appeared healthy at first, he carried within him the same genetic time bomb that had been ticking through generations of Habsburgs. He would die before his 7th birthday, likely from the cumulative effects of inbreeding. Some historians believe he suffered from epilepsy, others point to a general physical weakness that made him vulnerable to any passing illness. Maria Antonia never recovered from his death. She had more children, daughters who survived, which was something. But the loss of her son broke something inside her. She became deeply religious, spending hours in prayer, perhaps trying to understand why God would take her boy. She died in 1692 at just 23 years old. The official cause was listed as a sudden illness, but really, her body had been fighting against itself since conception. Her heart, her lungs, her immune system, all compromised by generations of genetic collapse. When they buried her in Munich, they buried more than a princess. They buried the evidence of what happens when power becomes more important than people, when bloodline purity matters more than biological reality. Maria Antonia of Austria, the most inbred Habsburg, A name history forgot, but a body that tells a story we desperately need to remember. Now let's travel backward in time and across the Mediterranean to ancient Egypt, where another royal family was engaged in the same dangerous game, but with even more intensity. When you hear the name Cleopatra, you probably picture Elizabeth Taylor in elaborate eye makeup, or maybe you think of the romance with Mark Antony. But here's what most people don't realise. Cleopatra VII, the famous one, came from a family that made the Habsburgs look genetically diverse. The Ptolemaic dynasty, which ruled Egypt for nearly 300 years, had a peculiar tradition. Brothers married sisters, as a matter of course, not distant cousins, not second or third relations, full siblings. This wasn't seen as scandalous or unusual. It was expected, required even. The reasoning was both religious and political. The Ptolemies were Greek, not Egyptian, descendants of one of Alexander the Great's generals, who'd carved out Egypt for himself after Alexander's death. They were foreigners ruling over a native population, and they were determined to keep power within their bloodline. They also wanted to emulate the ancient Egyptian pharaohs, some of whom had married siblings to keep the royal bloodline pure. Cleopatra's family tree, if you can even call it that, is almost impossible to diagram. Her parents were siblings, her grandparents were siblings. Go back further, and the pattern repeats, over and over, generation after generation of brothers marrying sisters, producing children who would then marry their siblings. By the time Cleopatra was born, in 69 BCE, her genetic diversity was catastrophically limited. Scientists who've studied her lineage estimate that she had roughly the same level of genetic diversity as someone whose parents were full siblings and whose grandparents were full siblings. Think about what that means for a developing fetus. Every genetic weakness, every recessive trait, every potential disorder, all amplified, doubled down, reinforced. And yet somehow, Cleopatra survived. Not just survived, thrived. She was reportedly intelligent, charismatic, a skilled politician and strategist. She spoke multiple languages. She understood economics, military tactics, and diplomacy. She was, by all historical accounts, remarkable. But she was also an exception. And we often forget about all the siblings who didn't survive. All the babies born with deformities so severe they died within days. All the stillbirths and miscarriages that are hinted at in fragmentary historical records but never fully documented. Cleopatra herself had 4 children, 1 with Julius Caesar, 3 with Mark Antony. And here's what's interesting. She deliberately chose to have children with foreigners. Not her brother husbands. Yes, plural, she was married to 2 of her brothers at different points, as was tradition. She chose Roman generals, men whose genetic lineage was completely separate from her own. Was this a conscious decision? Did she understand on some level that her family's bloodline had become dangerously constricted? We'll never know for certain, but it's telling that her children with Caesar and Antony were reportedly healthy, while so many of her purely Ptolemaic relatives struggled with health issues. When Cleopatra died in 30 BCE, whether by suicide or murder, history still debates. She took with her the last gasp of the Ptolemaic dynasty. There were no more Ptolemies to marry each other. The experiment in extreme royal inbreeding finally ended, not with a whimper, but with the death of one of history's most famous women. But here's what haunts me about Cleopatra's story. How many brilliant women like her were never born because of genetic catastrophe? How many potential queens, poets, strategists, and leaders were lost to stillbirths and infant mortality caused by inbreeding? How many women suffered through pregnancy after pregnancy, their bodies unable to sustain the lives growing inside them? Cleopatra survived the genetic lottery, but for every Cleopatra, there were dozens of forgotten sisters, cousins, and daughters whose bodies couldn't overcome the burden of their bloodline. Let's move forward to the 18th century Portugal, where we meet a woman whose story is both tragic and deeply misunderstood. Maria I, the first queen regnant of Portugal. History remembers her as Maria the Mad. But before we get to the madness, let's talk about how she got there. Maria was born in 1734 as the eldest daughter of King José I of Portugal. From the moment of her birth, her fate was sealed. She would marry, produce heirs, and secure the Portuguese throne. The question was who she would marry. In most European courts, this would involve negotiations with neighbouring kingdoms, careful diplomacy, strategic alliances. But in Portugal, the decision was simple. She would marry her uncle, her father's own brother, Pedro. Pedro was 17 years older than Maria. He'd been waiting in the wings his entire life, knowing that his path to power ran through marriage to his niece. When Maria turned 25, late by royal standards, which tells you something about how reluctant this match might have been, the wedding finally took place. This wasn't just a political marriage, it was genetic Russian roulette. Maria and Pedro were uncle and niece, which means they shared 25% of their DNA. That's the same amount of genetic similarity as between a grandmother and grandchild, or between half-siblings. When closely related people have children together, every recessive genetic trait has a much higher chance of being expressed. Rare disorders become common, hidden weaknesses become obvious problems, and for Maria and Pedro's children, this played out in the cruelest way possible. They had 6 children together, 6 pregnancies, 6 births, 6 tiny coffins. Well, not quite. 3 of their children survived to adulthood, but 3 others, 3 babies who should have grown up to play in palace gardens and learn statecraft and maybe even rule, died young. The official records are sparse, as they always are when it comes to royal infant mortality. A brief notation: died in infancy, no cause given. No details about whether the baby lived for days or weeks. Just gone. For Maria, each loss must have been devastating. Imagine carrying a child for 9 months, enduring the agony of birth without modern medicine, holding your baby in your arms, and then watching that child fade away. Imagine doing that 3 times. Imagine wondering if it's your fault, if something is wrong with your body, if God is punishing you. And all the while, knowing you have to try again, have to produce more heirs, have to keep the dynasty alive. The 3 children who survived weren't exactly healthy either. Her eldest son, José, was frail and prone to illness. When he contracted smallpox in his early 20s, his body couldn't fight it off. Maria watched him die, slowly and painfully, likely feeling the same helplessness she'd felt when her infants died. This was 1788. Maria had been queen since 1777, ruling alongside her husband-uncle Pedro until his death in 1786. She'd endured the death of 3 infant children, the death of her husband, and now the death of her heir. Something inside her snapped. The onset of her mental illness was sudden and severe. She began having vivid religious hallucinations, convinced that she was damned to hell for her sins. She heard voices. She screamed at night, tormented by visions of demons. She became unable to make decisions, unable to fulfill her role as queen. Modern psychiatrists who've studied the historical accounts believe Maria likely suffered from severe depression with psychotic features, possibly bipolar disorder. Some have also suggested that the stress of her losses, combined with possible genetic predispositions exacerbated by inbreeding, created a perfect storm of mental illness. Her son João, who became Prince Regent and effectively ruled in her place, tried to help her. He brought in doctors, priests, anyone who might ease her suffering. But 18th century medicine had no real treatment for mental illness. She was bled, purged, confined to her apartments, well-meaning torture disguised as healing. Maria lived for another 27 years after her breakdown, locked away in her own palace. a ghost queen. She died in 1816 in Brazil, where the royal family had fled during the Napoleonic Wars. She was 81 years old, a remarkable age for the time, which makes her story even more poignant. Her body survived. Her mind did not. When we remember Maria I as Maria the Mad, we're forgetting everything that led to her madness: the uncle she was forced to marry, the children she buried, the genetic burden she carried, the impossible expectations placed on her shoulders. She wasn't mad, she was broken by a system that valued bloodline purity more than human wellness, by a family structure that saw nothing wrong with uncle-niece marriage, by a world that gave her no choice, no voice, no escape. Before we continue with more of these heartbreaking stories, I want to ask you something. Have you ever wondered what it would be like to be remembered only by a number? Not a name, not a story, just a catalogue entry? That's exactly what happened to two baby girls born over 3,000 years ago in ancient Egypt. Today, archaeologists call them Mummy 317A and Mummy 317B. We don't know their real names. We don't know if they lived for hours or days. We don't even know for certain if they were born alive. But we do know this: they were the daughters of the most famous pharaoh in history, Tutankhamun. In 1907, when archaeologists were excavating in the Valley of the Kings, they discovered Tutankhamun's tomb. Or rather, they discovered the most intact royal tomb ever found in Egypt. The treasures inside were beyond imagining. Golden masks, elaborate furniture, chariots, weapons, jewellery. It was the archaeological find of the century. But among all that gold and glory, tucked away in a simple wooden box, were two tiny mummies, babies, so small that at first they were almost overlooked in the excitement over the golden treasures. When they were finally examined decades later, using modern forensic techniques, the story they told was devastating. These were Tutankhamun's daughters, both premature, both showing signs of genetic disorders, both dead either at birth or shortly after. And when scientists traced back their family tree, they discovered why. Tutankhamun's father was Akhenaten, the heretic pharaoh who tried to reform Egyptian religion. His mother was, well, that's where it gets complicated. For a long time, historians thought his mother might be the famous Nefertiti, but DNA testing in 2010 revealed something different. Tutankhamun's mother was a woman known only as the Younger Lady, a mummy found in a different tomb, identified only by her DNA. And here's the crucial detail: the Younger Lady was Akhenaten's full sister. Tutankhamun was the child of brother-sister incest, just like Cleopatra would be centuries later. But the genetic disaster didn't stop there, because when Tutankhamun came of age and needed to marry, he married Ankhesenamun, who was likely his half-sister. Some historians even suggest she might have been his full sister, though the evidence is unclear. So these two baby girls, Mummy 317A and 317B, were the products of at least 2 generations of sibling incest, possibly 3. Their little bodies tell the story. One of them had spina bifida, a severe spinal deformity. The other showed signs of Sprengel's deformity, a condition affecting the shoulder blade. Both had cranial abnormalities. Both were born months too early. They never had a chance. And their mother, Ankhesenamun, still just a teenager herself, had to endure not 1 but 2 pregnancies that ended in death. Had to go through labour, probably in excruciating pain, probably knowing already that something was wrong, probably terrified. After Tutankhamun's death, when Ankhesenamun was only about 18 or 19, she disappeared from the historical record. Some historians believe she was forced to marry Ai, the elderly vizier who took the throne. Others think she died young, perhaps from complications related to these pregnancies. We'll never know for certain. But what we do know is this: those 2 unnamed baby girls, catalogued as Mummy 317A and 317B, represent thousands of royal children across history who paid the ultimate price for their parents' bloodline. They were born into the most powerful family in the world. They should have grown up to be princesses, maybe even pharaohs themselves. Instead, they're museum specimens, numbers, evidence of a failed genetic experiment. When I think about them, I don't think about the gold or the glory of ancient Egypt. I think about their mother, barely more than a child herself, holding these tiny bodies and knowing they would never take a breath. I think about the silence in the palace after the births, the servants whispering, the priests performing funeral rites for babies who never even got to see sunlight. This is what royal inbreeding really looked like. Not just statistics and genetic coefficients, but tiny coffins, silent nurseries, mothers' tears. Now let's jump forward to 19th century Spain, where we meet a queen whose life reads like a tragedy in 5 acts. Isabella II was born in 1830, and her very existence was considered a miracle. Not because of anything special about Isabella herself, though she would turn out to be quite remarkable in her own way, but because her father had been trying desperately to produce an heir. King Ferdinand VII had been married 3 times before Isabella's mother came into the picture. 3 wives, 3 failures to produce a living child. The Spanish succession was in crisis. If Ferdinand died without an heir, the throne would pass to his brother Carlos, setting off a civil war that no one wanted. So in 1829, Ferdinand married for the 4th time. His bride, Maria Cristina of the 2 Sicilies, his niece. Yes, uncle niece again, because apparently European royalty had exactly one solution to every problem: marry a relative. Maria Cristina was 23 years old, young enough to potentially bear many children, and she did get pregnant quickly, always a relief in royal circles. But when the baby arrived in October 1830, it was a girl, Isabella. In most of Europe at this time, female succession was either forbidden or deeply problematic. Spain had a law called Salic law, which prohibited women from inheriting the throne. But Ferdinand, desperate to prevent his brother Carlos from taking power, convinced the Spanish parliament to revoke Salic law just months before Isabella's birth. So Isabella became heir to the Spanish throne while still in her crib. A baby girl, born of an uncle-niece marriage, carrying the weight of a kingdom on her tiny shoulders. The genetic consequences of her parents' relationship showed up early. Isabella and her younger sister, also born of the same union, were described by court physicians as delicate. They were prone to illness, slow to develop, smaller than average, nothing catastrophic. They both survived childhood, which was more than many inbred royal children managed, but there were signs that something wasn't quite right. The real disaster came when Isabella reached marriageable age. At 16, Isabella was forced into a double wedding with her sister. The grooms, their cousins, their double first cousins to be precise, meaning they shared both sets of grandparents. Isabella's husband, Francisco de Assis, was widely rumoured to be gay. The marriage was a disaster from the start. Francisco had no interest in his teenage bride, and Isabella, for her part, was horrified by him. But duty demanded heirs, so somehow Isabella ended up pregnant 11 times. 11 pregnancies over the course of about 15 years, and of those 11 babies, only 5 survived infancy. 5 out of 11. Think about that ratio. More than half of Isabella's children died as babies or toddlers. And here's the truly cruel part. Historians are almost certain that none of the surviving children were actually fathered by Francisco. Isabella, trapped in a loveless marriage to a man who wouldn't touch her, took lovers, multiple lovers, and those lovers gave her the children her husband could not. But even with fresh genetic material from outside the royal family, more than half her babies still died, which tells you something about Isabella's own genetic burden. Something about what generations of inbreeding had done to her body's ability to carry a pregnancy to term, to produce viable children. The children who did survive, Isabel, Alfonso, Pilar, Paz, Eulalia, were healthier than they might have been, probably because they weren't inbred. But they grew up knowing they were bastards, knowing the king wasn't really their father, knowing their mother was whispered about, scorned, mocked by the very court that should have protected her. Isabella's reign was turbulent. Spain was modernizing, industrializing, and the old royal structures were crumbling. There were revolts, political crises, economic disasters, and through it all, Isabella kept getting pregnant, kept losing babies, kept trying to hold together a dynasty and a nation that were both falling apart. In 1868, a military coup forced Isabella to flee to France. She was only 38 years old, but she'd lived through more loss and trauma than most people experience in twice that time. She spent the rest of her life in exile, dying in Paris in 1904 at age 73. History judges Isabella harshly. She's remembered as a failed monarch, a scandalous queen, a woman whose affairs destroyed her credibility. But I think we should remember her differently. She was a child bride forced into marriage with a man who didn't want her. She was a woman whose body endured 11 pregnancies and buried 6 children. She was a queen trying to navigate impossible political circumstances while dealing with personal tragedy after personal tragedy. She was born into a genetic trap set by centuries of royal inbreeding, and she spent her entire life trying to escape it, even as it destroyed her reputation, her reign, and her family. As we move deeper into these stories, I want to pause and ask you something. When you think about the phrase political marriage, what comes to mind? Maybe you imagine a sort of business arrangement, cold and transactional, but ultimately bearable. 2 strangers uniting kingdoms, learning to tolerate each other, maybe even developing affection over time. But what if the political marriage wasn't just about uniting kingdoms? What if it was also about ending a war, about literally saving your entire country from destruction? And what if you were just 18 years old and the man you had to marry was your father's sworn enemy? That was the situation facing Mary Louise of Austria in 1810. Mary Louise was born in 1791, the eldest daughter of Francis II, Holy Roman Emperor. Her childhood was defined by war. Her father and Napoleon Bonaparte, the upstart French general who'd crowned himself emperor, had been at each other's throats for years. Austria had been invaded, defeated, humiliated. The empire was on its knees. And then Napoleon, newly divorced from Josephine because she couldn't give him an heir, decided he needed a new wife. A wife from a properly royal family. A wife who could give him the son Josephine could not. He wanted Mary Louise. Imagine being 18 and learning that you're going to marry the man who spent your entire adolescence destroying your country, the man your father hates, the man who's responsible for Austria's humiliation and defeat. Mary Louise wept when she was told. She begged her father to refuse. But Francis was pragmatic. This marriage would bring peace. It would protect Austria from further attacks. It would elevate the Habsburg family by linking them to the new French Empire. So Mary Louise, who'd grown up listening to stories about how evil Napoleon was, found herself on a journey to France to become his empress. But here's the part most history books gloss over. Mary Louise was already genetically compromised before she ever met Napoleon. She was the product of a marriage between double first cousins. Her father and mother shared both sets of grandparents. This means Mary Louise had only 4 unique great-grandparents, instead of the normal 8. Her genetic diversity was severely limited from birth. She was the eldest of 12 children, and only 7 lived to age 18. Not a great survival rate, and it's highly likely that the 5 who died young were affected by genetic disorders caused by inbreeding. So when Mary Louise arrived in France and married Napoleon, she was carrying generations of Habsburg inbreeding in her DNA. And Napoleon, for all his military genius, didn't understand or care about genetics. He just wanted an heir. Mary Louise got pregnant almost immediately, and in March 1811, she gave birth to a healthy baby boy, Napoleon II, known as the King of Rome. The relief must have been overwhelming. She'd done it. Produced a male heir, saved her family's honour, proved her worth. But here's what's often forgotten. Being pregnant at 19 in 1811 was incredibly dangerous, even for healthy women. And Mary Louise, with her compromised genetic background, was at higher risk for complications. She apparently had a difficult labour that lasted over 20 hours. At one point, Napoleon was told he might have to choose between saving his wife or his son. He reportedly chose his son. Mary Louise survived, thank God. But imagine knowing that your husband would have let you die to save the baby. Imagine recovering from that kind of traumatic birth with that knowledge. And then just 3 years later, Napoleon's empire collapsed. He was defeated, exiled to Elba, and Mary Louise was suddenly a widow with a toddler son. Well, not quite a widow, Napoleon was still alive, but she never saw him again. Her son, the little King of Rome, died at age 21 from tuberculosis. Some historians suggest his early death might have been related to genetic weakness from his mother's side, though it's impossible to prove. Mary Louise lived until 1847, marrying twice more and having more children. But she never returned to the prominence she'd had as Napoleon's empress. She became a footnote, the Habsburg princess who married the Corsican upstart. But when I think about Mary Louise, I think about that 18-year-old girl weeping at the news of her arranged marriage. I think about her terrifying journey to France to marry her father's enemy. I think about her agonizing 20-hour labor and the knowledge that her husband was willing to let her die. She was a pawn, a vessel, a means to an end. And her body, already compromised by generations of inbreeding, was pushed to its limits to serve political purposes she had no say in. Now let's talk about something that might surprise you. Royal inbreeding didn't end in the 19th century. It continued well into the 20th century, and the woman we're about to discuss was born in 1965. 1965. The year the Beatles released Help. The year America started heavily escalating the Vietnam War. The year mini skirts were all the rage. And yet, European royalty was still marrying within their own bloodlines, still producing genetically compromised children, still acting like it was perfectly normal to marry your cousin. Princess Alexia of Greece was born into the Greek royal family on July 10th, 1965. Her parents were King Constantine II of Greece and Queen Anne-Marie of Denmark. On the surface, this looks like a standard royal marriage between two different countries, but when you dig deeper into their ancestry, you discover that Constantine and Anne-Marie were second cousins, third cousins twice over, and probably related in several other ways that are hard to diagram. Both were direct descendants of Queen Victoria of England, which means they carried some of the same genetic mutations that plagued Victoria's descendants, most notably haemophilia, the royal disease that caused uncontrolled bleeding and killed several of Victoria's male descendants. Both were also descended from Christian IX of Denmark, known as the father-in-law of Europe, because his children married into royal families across the continent. This created a tangled web of relationships where everyone was related to everyone else, in multiple ways. Constantine himself was quite inbred in his own right. His great-grandparents included 2 siblings, meaning his family tree had collapsed in on itself a generation before he was even born. His grandmother was the sister to his great-grandfather, not through 2 different marriages, but because one person in the family tree shows up in multiple positions. Anne-Marie wasn't quite as inbred as Constantine, but she carried her own genetic baggage from generations of Danish royal intermarriage. So when they had children together, 5 in total, including Alexia, those children were getting a double dose of compromised genetics from both sides. Now here's the thing about modern royal inbreeding. It's subtler than the Habsburg jaw or the mental illness of Maria I. The effects are more hidden, more chronic, less visually obvious, but they're still there. We don't have detailed medical records for Princess Alexia. Royal families guard those closely. But we do know that the Greek royal family has dealt with various health issues over the generations. And we know from genetic studies that even moderate levels of inbreeding can lead to reduced fertility, higher rates of miscarriage, increased susceptibility to disease, and various chronic health conditions. The Greek monarchy was abolished in 1973 when Alexia was just 8 years old. The family went into exile, living in England and later Denmark. In some ways, this was probably a blessing for Alexia. Freed from royal duties, she could live a more normal life, marry whom she chose. She married a Spanish architect in 1999, and escape some of the pressures that had crushed earlier generations of royal women. But I include her story here because it's important to understand that inbreeding isn't just ancient history. It's not just something that happened to unfortunate Habsburg princesses in the 1600s. It continued into living memory, into the modern era, into a time when we definitely knew better. The fact that royal families were still arranging marriages between relatives in the 1960s, after we'd discovered DNA, after we'd developed modern genetics, after we'd seen the tragic consequences played out over centuries, tells you something about how deeply entrenched these attitudes were. Power mattered more than biology. Tradition mattered more than health. Keeping the bloodline pure mattered more than the well-being of the actual human beings being born into these families. Princess Alexia is alive today, living a relatively private life, and I'm genuinely happy that she escaped the worst of what could have happened. But she's also living proof that the practice of royal inbreeding was still happening within our lifetime. We've talked about Maria Antonia, the most inbred Habsburg ever documented, but she wasn't the only genetic catastrophe in her generation, not by a long shot. Let's talk about her cousins, the daughters of King Philip IV of Spain. Charles II of Spain is famous, or infamous, for being the physical embodiment of what extreme inbreeding does to a human body. His Habsburg jaw was so severe he could barely chew food. His tongue was too large for his mouth, making speech difficult. He was likely infertile. He suffered from constant health problems and died at 38 without producing any heirs, ending the Spanish Habsburg line. But Charles had sisters, half-sisters technically, from his father's various marriages, and their stories are just as tragic, just as horrifying, just as telling about what life was like for royal women in this genetic disaster. Maria Theresa of Spain was Philip IV's eldest daughter from his first marriage. She was born in 1638, and like all Spanish princesses, her fate was determined before she could even walk. She would be married off to a powerful ally to secure Spain's political position. When she was 22, she was shipped off to France to marry her first cousin, King Louis XIV, the Sun King himself. Yes, first cousin. Philip IV and Louis XIV's mother were brother and sister, making Louis and Maria Theresa's marriage yet another uncle-niece level relationship. Maria Theresa was reportedly beautiful when she arrived in France, though French courtiers were shocked by her Spanish fashions and customs. She never quite fit in at Versailles, never mastered French beyond a basic level, never understood the elaborate etiquette of Louis's court. But she did her duty. She got pregnant, over and over again. 6 times Maria Theresa gave birth. 6 pregnancies, 6 labours, and how many of her children survived past early childhood? 1. Just 1. Louis, the Grand Dauphin, who was born in 1661. The other 5, all dead. Some were stillborn. Some died within days of birth. Some made it a few years before illness took them. The causes are listed vaguely in records: convulsions, fever, weakness. But really we know what killed them: inbreeding. Maria Theresa herself wasn't particularly healthy. She gained weight rapidly after her pregnancies and developed various chronic ailments. She died at age 44, not tragically young by 17th century standards, but not old either. The official cause was an abscess on her arm that became infected. No antibiotics, no proper surgical technique, just blood poisoning spreading through her body while she lay in agony. Louis XIV, her husband, was supposedly saddened by her death, but he'd been cheating on her throughout their marriage with numerous mistresses, most famously Madame de Montespan. Maria Theresa knew about the affairs. Everyone at court knew, but she couldn't protest, couldn't leave, couldn't even complain publicly without bringing shame on herself. She was a Spanish princess, married to cement an alliance between two great powers. Her feelings didn't matter, her health didn't matter, only her ability to produce heirs mattered, and even that was compromised by her own inbred genetics. But Maria Theresa's story, tragic as it is, pales in comparison to her half-sister, Margaret Theresa of Spain. Margaret Theresa was born in 1651 to Philip IV's second wife, Mariana of Austria, who was also Philip IV's niece. So Margaret Theresa was born from an uncle-niece marriage, just like Marie Antonia of Austria would be a generation later. Margaret Theresa was a beautiful child. We know this because the artist Diego Velázquez painted her repeatedly. There's a famous painting called Las Meninas that shows her at age 5, surrounded by her maids of honor, looking like an ethereal little doll in an elaborate dress. But that painting hides the reality. Margaret Theresa was frail, prone to illness, small for her age, and at age 15 she was married off to her uncle. Yes, her actual uncle, her mother's brother, Holy Roman Emperor Leopold I. This made Margaret Theresa simultaneously the wife and niece of Leopold I. Her children would be born from an uncle-niece marriage. The genetic implications were catastrophic. Margaret Theresa had 4 children. All 4 died in infancy or early childhood, every single one. Imagine being 15, 16, 17, 18 years old, going through pregnancy and childbirth 4 times, and never getting to raise a child to adulthood. Imagine the physical toll, the emotional devastation, the desperation to produce a healthy heir. Knowing your worth as a queen depends entirely on your ability to do so. Margaret Theresa herself died at age 21. 21? She'd been married for 6 years, pregnant for a significant portion of that time, and she died before most modern women even finish college. The official cause, complications after her 4th childbirth. But really, her body had been destroyed by constant pregnancies, by the genetic burden she carried, by the uncle-niece relationship that guaranteed her children would be compromised. Leopold I grieved, apparently genuinely, but within months he was negotiating his next marriage, because emperors need heirs. And his next wife? Her name was Claudia Felicitas. She died in childbirth 2 years later. And his wife, after that? That was Maria Antonia, the most inbred Habsburg we discussed earlier. Do you see the pattern? These men just kept marrying relatives, kept producing genetically damaged children, kept watching their wives die young, and learned absolutely nothing. While we're on the topic of impossible situations, let's talk about another Portuguese princess, Maria Francisca Benedita. Born in 1746, Maria Francisca was the daughter of King José I of Portugal. She grew up watching her older sister, Maria, yes, the same Maria we discussed earlier, preparing to take the throne someday. Maria Francisca was the spare heir, the backup plan, the one who wasn't quite as important, which made her perfect for a political marriage that no one else wanted. At age 18, Maria Francisca was married off to her uncle, her mother's brother, Joseph of Bragança. This was becoming a pattern in the Portuguese royal family. Keep it all in the family, marry uncles to nieces, consolidate power, maintain control. The marriage was reportedly unhappy. Joseph was much older, already set in his ways, and had little interest in his teenage bride, beyond her reproductive capacity. Maria Francisca, for her part, had no choice in the matter. This was her duty. She had 2 children, both sons. On the surface, this looks like success. She'd produced heirs, done her job. But both boys were weak, sickly, prone to mysterious ailments that doctors couldn't diagnose or treat. One died at age 11. The other lived longer, but never had children of his own. And then came the earthquake. In 1755, when Maria Francisca was just 9 years old, Lisbon was struck by one of the deadliest earthquakes in European history. The city was devastated. Tens of thousands died. The royal palace was destroyed. Maria Francisca and her family survived, but the trauma affected everyone. Imagine growing up in the aftermath of that disaster. Imagine the constant fear of aftershocks, the murmur of buildings collapsing, the screams of the injured and dying. Imagine trying to maintain royal dignity while your entire world had literally collapsed around you. Maria Francisca lived until 1829, dying at age 82. A remarkably long life for someone from such an inbred family. But longevity doesn't mean quality. She spent her later years dealing with various chronic health issues, watching her children and grandchildren die, seeing her family's power diminish. She was another woman whose body was used as a political tool, whose genetic burden was increased by forced marriage to a close relative, whose children paid the price for decisions made by men who cared more about power than people. Now I want to shift gears dramatically and talk about something that happened in our own time, in a modern country, in a situation that shows us that inbreeding isn't just a historical problem of royal families. In 2012, Australian police discovered a family living in isolation in the bush of New South Wales. The family, given the pseudonym Colt to protect the children, had been practicing deliberate, sustained incest for multiple generations. When authorities finally intervened, they found 40 people living in horrendous conditions. No running water, no electricity, no formal education for the children, and genetic testing revealed that many of the children were products of father-daughter, brother-sister, and uncle-niece relationships. One of the adult women in the family, given the pseudonym Kimberly Colt, was found to be one of the most inbred people ever documented in modern medical literature. Her genetic analysis showed a level of inbreeding comparable to if her parents had been full siblings for multiple generations. Kimberly had severe physical and cognitive disabilities. She couldn't read or write. She had significant health problems, and she'd been sexually abused by family members, likely since childhood, producing children who were themselves severely disabled. This wasn't medieval royalty trying to preserve their bloodline. This was criminal abuse, a family patriarch who systematically sexually abused his daughters and granddaughters, keeping them isolated from society, preventing them from getting education or healthcare, creating a genetic nightmare. When the children were removed and examined, doctors found evidence of horrifying health problems: blindness, deafness, intellectual disabilities, physical deformities. Some of the children couldn't speak properly. Many had never seen a dentist or doctor. They'd been living in conditions that would be unthinkable in any modern society. I include this story not to sensationalize or exploit these victims, but to make a crucial point. The same genetic disasters that befell royal families happen to anyone who engages in sustained inbreeding. It doesn't matter if you're a Habsburg empress or a woman trapped in an abusive family in rural Australia. The biological consequences are the same. Genetics don't care about your title, your wealth, or your reasons. When closely related people have children together, those children are at massive risk for genetic disorders. When that pattern continues for multiple generations, the risk compounds exponentially. The cult children are now in foster care, receiving the medical and educational help they need. But they'll carry the physical and psychological scars of their inbred genetics for the rest of their lives. Just like Maria Antonia of Austria, just like Cleopatra's unnamed siblings, just like Margaret Teresa of Spain, the crown doesn't make the suffering more or less tragic. The suffering is the same. I want to take you back to the 17th century France now, to meet a woman whose name might not be familiar, but whose story encapsulates everything we've been talking about. Marie-Louise of Orléans was born in 1662 as the daughter of Philippe I, Duke of Orléans, who was the younger brother of King Louis XIV. This made Marie-Louise the king's niece, born into the absolute centre of French power and prestige. Her childhood was spent at Versailles, that glittering palace of mirrors and secrets. She was raised alongside her cousins, the children of Louis XIV and Maria Teresa of Spain. Remember Maria Teresa, the first cousin marriage that produced mostly dead babies? Marie-Louise grew up watching that tragedy unfold firsthand, but she probably never imagined she'd be forced into the same genetic trap. In 1679, when Marie-Louise was just 17, she was informed that she was to be married to King Charles II of Spain. Yes, that Charles II, the one with the Habsburg jaw, the one who could barely speak or eat, the one who was the living embodiment of genetic collapse. Marie-Louise was horrified. She'd seen paintings of Charles. She knew about his disabilities. She begged her uncle, the king, to reconsider. She wept. She threw what we'd now call a panic attack. She was so distraught that Louis XIV had to drag her to the altar personally, commanding her to do her duty. Imagine being 17 and being forced to marry a severely disabled man twice your age who you'd never met, simply because it would create a political alliance between France and Spain. Imagine having no choice, no voice, no agency in the decision that would define the rest of your life. The marriage was a disaster from day one. Marie-Louise arrived in Spain and was immediately subjected to the suffocating etiquette of the Spanish court. She couldn't dress the way she wanted, couldn't eat French food, couldn't speak freely. Everything was regimented, controlled, watched, and Charles? Well, Charles tried to be a good husband in his way, but he was incapable of producing children. His physicians believed he was likely sterile, a common consequence of extreme inbreeding. Marie-Louise was expected to get pregnant, but it was physically impossible. The Spanish court blamed her, of course. She must be barren. She must be cursed. She must have done something to anger God. The pressure was immense, constant, crushing. Marie-Louise wrote desperate letters back to France, begging to come home, describing how miserable she was. But she was told over and over that she had to stay, had to keep trying, had to do her duty. In 1689, at age 27, Marie-Louise died suddenly. The official cause was listed as appendicitis, but rumours swirled immediately. Some said she'd been poisoned, others suggested she'd taken her own life. Still others whispered that she'd simply given up, that her body had stopped fighting because her spirit was already gone. We'll never know the truth, but what we do know is that Marie-Louise spent 10 years of her life trapped in a nightmare marriage to a man whose body and mind had been destroyed by generations of inbreeding. She was punished for his family's genetic sins. She died young, childless, miserable, far from home. And for what? The alliance between France and Spain didn't last. Charles II died childless in 1700, triggering the War of Spanish Succession. Everything Marie-Louise had suffered through, everything she'd endured, it was all for nothing. Earlier, I mentioned the cult family and the horrors of modern inbreeding. But there's another case from recent decades that deserves attention: the Whittaker family of West Virginia. Lorene Whittaker, born in the mid-20th century, grew up in one of the most isolated and inbred families in modern America. The Whittakers had been practicing incest for generations, not because of any ideological commitment to bloodline purity like the Habsburgs, but because of poverty, isolation, and a family culture that normalized sexual abuse. Lorene herself was likely the product of incestuous relationship, possibly brother-sister or father-daughter. The exact details are murky because the family didn't keep records, and DNA testing wasn't common until relatively recently. What we do know is that Lorene had severe cognitive disabilities. She never learned to read or write properly. She had difficulty with speech. She lived her entire life in rural poverty, isolated from mainstream society. And then Lorene had a child, Timmy Whittaker. Timmy is considered one of the most inbred people alive today. DNA analysis suggests that his parents were closely related, possibly siblings or parent-child. His level of genetic homozygosity, meaning identical genes from both parents, is comparable to that of ancient Egyptian pharaohs, born from brother-sister unions. Timmy has severe disabilities. He's nonverbal, unable to care for himself, requires constant supervision. His physical features show signs of inbreeding: widely spaced eyes, a small cranium, underdeveloped facial structure. But here's what breaks my heart about Lorene and Timmy's story. Unlike the royal inbred women we've discussed, they never had wealth or privilege to cushion their suffering. They never had court physicians or comfortable palaces. They lived in poverty, in a shack with no running water, subjected to ongoing abuse, invisible to the world. Lorene died relatively young, likely from health complications exacerbated by her inbred genetics and poor living conditions. Timmy is still alive, now cared for by social services, but will never be independent. Their story reminds us that inbreeding doesn't just affect the powerful, it affects the vulnerable, the isolated, the exploited, and in modern times, it's often tied to abuse, poverty, and the failure of society to protect its most at-risk members. I want to pause here for a moment and ask you something, wherever you are, right now, whatever time it is. What do you think drove these families, both royal and common, to keep engaging in inbreeding even after they saw the tragic results? Was it really just about preserving power and bloodlines? Or was there something deeper, something psychological, that made people keep choosing this path generation after generation? Think about it while we continue, because the answer might be more complicated than it first appears. Let's travel now to the 18th century Germany, where the Holy Roman Empire's countless tiny principalities created a tangled web of intermarriages that makes even the Spanish Habsburgs look diverse. Louise of Mecklenburg-Strelitz was born in 1776 into a family that had been intermarrying with other German noble families for centuries. By the time Louise came along, tracking the relationships was nearly impossible. Everyone was related to everyone else in at least 3 different ways. Louise's own parents were third cousins, her grandparents were second cousins. Go back a few more generations and you find the same surnames appearing over and over: Mecklenburg, Brunswick, Saxony, Hanover. The gene pool was more like a gene puddle. At age 17, Louise married Crown Prince Frederick William of Prussia. And guess what? He was her distant cousin. Not a close cousin like some of the relationships we've discussed, but related nonetheless through multiple genealogical lines. Louise was reportedly beautiful, charming, and intelligent. She became Queen of Prussia when Frederick William took the throne, and she was beloved by the people. She's actually remembered as one of Prussia's greatest queens, known for her political acumen during the Napoleonic Wars. But behind the scenes, her body was betraying her. Louise had 10 children in quick succession, 10 pregnancies in about 14 years, and while most of her children survived childhood, a better rate than many inbred royals we've discussed. Many of them had health problems. Several were weak and sickly. At least 2 may have had intellectual disabilities, though court records are vague about such matters, and Louise herself was constantly ill. After each pregnancy, she struggled to recover. She developed what was probably chronic heart disease, though 18th century medicine couldn't diagnose it properly. She suffered from exhaustion, shortness of breath, and frequent fainting spells. In 1810, at age 34, while travelling with her husband to review troops, Louise collapsed. She'd been ill for weeks but insisted on making the trip because she felt it was her duty. She died a few days later, her heart simply giving out. 10 pregnancies by age 34. A body pushed past its limits. Genetic burden from generations of intermarriage. Political pressure to keep producing heirs. No real medical care. No understanding of genetics or reproductive health. Just duty, 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 until her body couldn't take any more. Not every inbred royal woman suffered dramatically. Some had relatively normal lives despite their genetic burden. But that doesn't mean the system wasn't cruel or dangerous. It just means they got lucky. Elizabeth of France, born in 1764, was the younger sister of King Louis XVI. Yes, the Louis XVI who would later be executed during the French Revolution. Elizabeth grew up at Versailles during the final years of the old regime, watching the corruption, excess, and inequality that would eventually tear France apart. Elizabeth never married. This wasn't by choice. Various marriage negotiations fell through for political reasons, which meant she never had children and never passed on whatever genetic issues she might have inherited. Her parents, Louis, Dauphin of France, and Maria Josepha of Saxony, were second cousins. Not as close as some royal marriages, but still related. Elizabeth likely carried some genetic burden from this, but without having children, we'll never know how severe it might have been. What makes Elizabeth's story relevant here is what happened during the Revolution. As the monarchy collapsed and her brother was arrested, Elizabeth chose to stay with the royal family. She could have fled to safety as an unmarried princess without political power. She wasn't the revolutionaries' main target, but she stayed. She was imprisoned with her brother, his wife Marie Antoinette, and their children. She watched Marie Antoinette be led to the guillotine. She watched her nephew die in prison, likely from neglect and abuse. And in May 1794, Elizabeth herself was executed. She was 30 years old, still unmarried, still childless, killed for being born into the wrong family. I include Elizabeth's story because it shows another dimension of what happened to royal women, even if they escaped the genetic lottery, even if they never had compromised children, they were still trapped by their bloodline, still prisoners of a system that saw them as pawns, not people. Before we move toward our conclusion, I want to talk about one more family that illustrates these issues, the Romanovs of Russia. The Russian imperial family in the late 19th and early 20th centuries wasn't as intensely inbred as the Habsburgs, but they were still marrying within a fairly limited pool of European royalty. And they were all descendants of Queen Victoria, which meant they were all at risk for carrying haemophilia, the royal disease. Empress Alexandra of Russia, born Princess Alix of Hesse in 1872, was a granddaughter of Queen Victoria. She married Tsar Nicholas II of Russia in 1894, and they had 5 children, 4 daughters, and finally, after years of hoping, a son, Alexei. Alexei was born with haemophilia. For those who don't know, haemophilia is a genetic disorder that prevents blood from clotting properly. Even a minor cut or bruise can lead to life-threatening bleeding. Before modern treatment, haemophiliacs often died young from injuries that wouldn't seriously harm a healthy person. The gene for haemophilia is carried on the X chromosome, which means women can be carriers without having the disease themselves. But if a carrier woman has a son, he has a 50% chance of inheriting the disease, Alexandra was a carrier. She'd inherited the gene from her grandmother Victoria, and she passed it to Alexei. The discovery that the heir to the Russian throne had haemophilia was devastating. It was kept secret from the public, but within the family, it was a constant source of terror. Alexei couldn't play roughly like other boys. He couldn't risk any injury. Several times he nearly died from internal bleeding, and there was nothing doctors could do except wait and hope. Alexandra was racked with guilt, knowing she'd passed the disease to her son. She became increasingly desperate, turning to folk healers and eventually falling under the influence of Grigory Rasputin, who claimed he could help Alexei. This relationship with Rasputin damaged the royal family's reputation and contributed to the conditions that led to the Russian Revolution. In 1918, the entire family, Nicholas, Alexandra, their 4 daughters, and Alexei, were executed by Bolsheviks. Alexei was only 13 years old. He would have died young anyway, most likely from his haemophilia. But instead, he died in a basement, shot along with his family, a victim of political upheaval partly caused by his mother's desperate attempts to save him. Alexandra's 4 daughters, Olga, Tatiana, Maria, and Anastasia, might have been haemophilia carriers themselves. We'll never know, because they were all killed before having children. Their bodies, the genetic legacy they carried, erased in a single night of violence. The Romanov story shows how genetic disorders from inbreeding could affect even families that weren't as extremely inbred as the Habsburgs. One recessive gene passed down through generations, causing untold suffering. And the women, Alexandra, her daughters, bearing both the genetic burden and the guilt, the fear, the helplessness. I think at this point, we need to step back and talk about why inbreeding causes these problems. Because it's easy to say inbreeding is bad, but understanding why makes these stories even more powerful. Every human carries recessive genetic mutations. These are genes that cause problems, but only if you inherit the same mutated gene from both parents. If you inherit one normal gene and one mutated gene, you're usually fine. The normal gene compensates for the broken one. When unrelated people have children together, the chances of both parents having the same rare recessive mutation are very low, so the child is unlikely to inherit 2 copies of the broken gene. But when closely related people have children, siblings, uncle, niece, first cousins, they share a large percentage of their genes, including the broken ones. The chances that both parents carry the same recessive mutation are much, much higher. This is why children of incest have such high rates of genetic disorders. They're likely to inherit 2 copies of multiple broken genes. And when this pattern continues for generations, as it did with the Habsburgs, the Ptolemies, the Portuguese royal family, the effect compounds. Each generation has a higher and higher chance of inheriting multiple genetic disorders. The gene pool gets smaller and smaller, more and more compromised. This explains the Habsburg jaw, the mental illness, the infant mortality, the stillbirths, the miscarriages, the chronic health problems. It wasn't God's punishment, or bad luck, or weakness. It was basic biology, playing out across centuries. The tragic irony is that these royal families thought they were preserving the purity and strength of their bloodlines. They thought they were protecting their power. But what they were actually doing was destroying their bloodlines from the inside out, weakening each generation, making it harder and harder for their children to survive and thrive. They sacrificed their descendants' health in the name of power. And the women, the mothers, the daughters, the princesses forced into these marriages, paid the highest price. So what's happened? How did this pattern finally break? For some families, like the Spanish Habsburgs, it ended when they simply couldn't produce any more heirs. Charles II died childless, and the Spanish throne passed to a different family, the Bourbons, who ironically would go on to practice their own cousin marriages. But that's another story. For other families like the Ptolemies, it ended with conquest. Rome absorbed Egypt, and the Ptolemaic line ended with Cleopatra. For still others, it ended with revolution. The French monarchy fell, the Russian monarchy fell, the Portuguese monarchy fell. Hereditary power itself became less absolute, less divine, less unquestionable. And slowly, gradually, European royal families began to understand that they needed to expand their gene pools. They began marrying commoners, gasp, or at least more distant relatives. They began prioritizing health over bloodline purity. But this change came too late for so many women. Too late for Maria Antonia, for Margaret Teresa, for all those Portuguese princesses. Too late for the countless babies who died in infancy or were stillborn. Too late for all the women who endured pregnancy after pregnancy, miscarriage after miscarriage, burying child after child. The system didn't change because people suddenly developed compassion for these suffering women. It changed because the royal lines were literally dying out, because the price of genetic collapse finally became impossible to ignore. Here's my third question for you, and I want you to really think about this one. In what ways do we still treat women's bodies as commodities, as vessels for someone else's purposes, even today in our supposedly enlightened modern world? The royal inbreeding era is over, yes. We're not forcing princesses to marry their uncles anymore. But are we really that different? When we pressure women about having children, about their biological clocks, about their duty to provide grandchildren, when we make laws controlling women's reproductive choices, when we judge women's worth by their fertility, aren't we echoing the same attitudes that saw Maria Antonia and Isabella II as nothing more than wombs with crowns? These historical stories matter not just because they're fascinating or tragic, but because they reflect patterns that still exist in different forms. The specific circumstances change, but the underlying attitude that women's bodies exist to serve purposes beyond their own well-being, that attitude persists. The Colt family and the Whittaker family, the modern cases we discussed, show that inbreeding still happens. It happens in isolated communities, in abusive family structures, in situations where women have no power to escape or say no. And when it does happen, it's still the women who bear the physical burden, who carry the pregnancies, who suffer the health consequences. As we approach the end of our journey tonight, I want us to think about these women not as curiosity, not as historical footnotes, but as real people who suffered real trauma. Maria Antonia of Austria, dying at 23, her body unable to continue. Cleopatra, brilliant and complex, carrying the burden of her ancestors' choices. Maria I of Portugal, descending into madness after loss piled upon loss. Margaret Teresa, dead at 21 after 4 devastating pregnancies. Isabella II, 11 pregnancies and only 5 surviving children. Marie-Louise, dragged to her wedding by the king himself at age 17. These weren't abstract statistics, they were women. They had thoughts, feelings, dreams, fears. They experienced pain, physical and emotional. They grieved their dead children. They endured difficult marriages. They lived in bodies that were struggling against themselves. And beyond the named royals, there were thousands of unnamed women, servants and commoners who also lived in inbred communities. Women whose stories were never recorded, whose names are lost, but who suffered just as much. We honour them by remembering, by telling their stories, by acknowledging the cruelty of the systems that trapped them, by recognising that behind every cold genealogical chart, every bloodline diagram, every genetic coefficient, there are human beings whose lives were shaped by forces beyond their control. So here we are, at the end of our journey through centuries of royal bloodlines and genetic tragedy. We've travelled from ancient Egypt to modern Australia, from the glittering palaces of Versailles to isolated shacks in rural America. We've met queens and princesses, empresses and forgotten daughters. And the thread connecting all their stories is this: women's bodies have always been considered political territory, vessels for continuing dynasties, tools for forging alliances, wombs valued more than the women themselves. The inbreeding was just one extreme manifestation of this attitude. But the attitude itself, that women's reproductive capacity is a resource to be controlled and exploited, that's the real disease. The genetic disorders were just the symptom. As you drift off to sleep tonight, think about these women. Think about their strength, their endurance, their suffering. Think about how they navigated impossible situations with limited power. Think about the children they buried and the pain they endured. And maybe, just maybe, think about how we can ensure that future generations of women are never again treated as commodities, that their bodies are respected as their own, that their health and well-being matter more than any bloodline, any dynasty, any political alliance. These women from history are whispering to us across the centuries. They're telling us their stories, showing us their scars, asking us to remember. So we remember, we bear witness, we honour them by refusing to forget. Thank you for joining me on this journey tonight. I know these stories are heavy, dark, difficult, but they're also important. They teach us about the past and inform how we think about the present. If you're still awake, I appreciate you staying with me through all these stories. If you're drifting off, I hope these tales give you something to dream about, or maybe think about tomorrow morning over coffee. Remember, history isn't just dates and battles and kings, it's also the women behind the scenes, the unnamed, the forgotten, the ones who bore the weight of dynasties on their bodies and in their DNA. Until next time, take care of yourselves, and remember, you are more than your bloodline, more than your genetics, more than anyone else's expectations. You are yourself, complete and valuable, exactly as you are. Good night, everyone. Sleep well.